Welcome to the Real Estate Conversation. The Malta Government recently issued their annual budget for 2020. Unsurprisingly, the Finance Minister, Professor Edward Scicluna, announced that the GDP is to grow by 4.3% with a surplus of 1.4%. The debt to GDP ratio declining further 40.4%, indicating a positive projection for the Maltese economy. Every year, the government issues measures related to the property market, and today I have with me Jessica Azzopardi, Warranted CPA, that focuses on international corporate and tax advisory. She is a holder of an ACCA qualification and advanced diploma in International Taxation, a former Big Four Senior Tax Supervisor, and today a corporate and tax partner at Finanzi Limited and Lecturer for ACCA Tax Professional and Fundamental Modules. Thanks for coming on the show, Jessica.
Thank you for inviting me, Jeff.
We're here to cover the changes and the extension of the property measures announced. The first and foremost, which I feel is of major importance, is the extension and the increase of threshold of the exemption of stamp duty for first-time buyers. The second significant extension is where stamp duty was reduced for those individuals buying property in Gozo, which was reduced to 2%, and the third extension was for those buying property in urban conservation areas, which remains at 2.5%. All have been extended for another year. Jessica, the latter is straightforward. However, I receive questions about this all the time, and sometimes it is interpreted wrongly. The easy one is if I am purchasing my first ever property, I will not pay stamp duty on the first 175,000, which would be equivalent to 8,750. If the price is above this amount, the buyer would pay 5% on the remainder of the purchase price. Is the first-time buyer scheme always applicable?
Well, to start with, for duty purposes, the standard rate is that of 5%. However, the law provides for some exemptions or reduced duty in certain circumstances, one of which, for example, we have the exemption of the first-time buyer scheme. However, it is not always the case. It specifically says that it has to be the first immovable property acquired. For example, if you have a garage, before you bought your first residential property, then the first-time buyer scheme is not eligible and you can't be exempt on the first 175,000. However, there is the reduced rate of 3.5% on the first 175,000 if you are acquiring a residential property, even if you have another immovable property, for example, like investments, a garage, and any other immovable property.
That's second-time buyer scheme?
No, I'm talking about the first-time buyer scheme. So you have either the scheme, if you are buying your first immovable property ever, you can apply for the first-time buyer scheme. Obviously, it has to be for residential purposes.
Okay.
If, however, you have, for example, a garage, you bought a garage before, you can't apply for the first-time buyer scheme. However, if you're buying the movable property for residential purpose, you would still benefit from a reduced rate of 30.5% for the first 175,000, and then again for the remaining it would be at 5%.
Okay. So that is a new change in the
3.5. It's been there for many years. The new change was the first time buyer scheme. I mean, new change. It was introduced a couple of years ago. What the new change in this year was about the 175,000. That in both instances, it was before up to 150,000, and now it increased to for the first 175,000.
Okay. Jessica, another question I get most often is related to a homeowner that is selling their first property to upgrade their home. If the owner completes the deed of their first property, will they be in a position to benefit from this scheme when they finalize the deed of their new home, since technically it will be their only residence?
So you can't apply for the first-time buyer because it has to be the first immovable property for residential purposes. However, there is this scheme of the second-time buyer scheme, where you will initially pay 5% on the 5% duty on the value of the immovable property, and then you will get a refund of 3.5% on the first 86,000.
Okay, all right. So.
And this will only be applicable if you sell your former movable property and you replace it within 1 year.
The reduced rate of 3.5% on stamp duty has been extended on inherited properties, but now will be applicable on the first 175,000. Can you explain further?
Correct. So if it wasn't the ordinary residence of the deceased, but is the ordinary residence of the person inheriting this property, the person who lives there for his residential property will be eligible to claim the 3.5%, where initially was on the first 150,000, it would be 3.5% on the first 175,000. So like that, it increased by 25,000. Any amount over that value would be at the standard rate of 5%. Okay. It's very good to mention as well, Jeff, about the inheritance of property, that if it was the ordinary residence of the deceased and it has been inherited by the spouse or the beneficiary or his children, that would be totally exempt.
During the budget, it was also announced that a reduced tax rate will be introduced on the transfer of a promise of sale. What were the exact changes?
So currently the law says that you have to pay 7% provisional tax of the profit on the transfer of the promise of sale, the convenio in Maltese. That profit that you made will be aggregated with the total income that you made during that year, and you will deduct the amount of 7% provisional tax which you already paid and will be taxed at the progressive tax rates. However, as from 1st January 2020, the government announced a new rate, a 15% final withholding tax instead of the 7% provisional tax, where you will be taxed at 15% on the first 100,000 of profits. It is still not clear all the rules how they're going to be announced, because we are still waiting for a legal notice for further details about this change.
Okay, so this will be for people speculating, people buying a property to basically to flip it, so to speak, or
there aren't any rules as of today, but basically when you buy and sell on convenio, so you haven't signed the contract, it is still on convenio, the profits made will not be taxed totally at your progressive tax rates, but the first 100,000 would be at 15% final withholding tax.
Okay. I think overall it was a positive budget. We've hit first-time buyers, second-time buyers. There was a measure mentioned where the government were giving interest-free grants for first-time buyers under 40, those that meet a certain criteria, which is a positive thing. There's also the reduction on the duty for those buying in the urban conservation areas. Overall, it looks positive. The economy is therefore still growing. Thanks for your insight, Jessica.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for coming on board. That was Budget 2020. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of the Real Estate Conversation.